right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 25th episode of When the Heart Leads. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Newburgh, founder of Books of Eden Publishing, and I am ecstatic to be with you all today. The title of this episode is Enough, and I'm going to be exploring the many different facets of enough, specifically having enough, being enough, giving enough, and saying enough. And what I want to mention is that this is actually the second recording I'm doing of the introduction, because when I recorded this live, there was some strange buzzing on the just for the first couple minutes. So the buzzing was a little distracting. So I'm just re-recording the introduction. So I'm going to give you kind of a quick play-by-play until we move into the kind of the main part of the teaching. So where we're going to come in is I've just kind of given the introduction and I'm talking about this writing group that I joined where every week we have kind of a theme. It's this beautiful writing group. It's an international group, people all over the world. We tune in, we meet every couple of weeks, and we're able to share a lot about our creative processes, and it's really beautiful. But the theme for this week was enough, and what it means to allow our presence and our being and the gift of our love to be enough. And so I've really been contemplating that. So this episode is kind of arising from that exploration and that contemplation that I've had this week. So with that, I'm just going to transition into the main part of the teaching, but I wanted to re-record this so that you got a sense of kind of where we're coming in. So enjoy. Most of our culture is predicated on those subtle and overt messages of not enough, right? The idea that we would need more, usually it's more, to be fulfilled. Or we would need to do more, accomplish more, give more, create more, right? And there's a really different feeling when that impulse comes from a place of lack versus a place of repletion. So the other word, kind of main word for this, is there's enough and there's that word replete. Like you've eaten a feast and you're replete. You're no longer hungry. And we talked last time about prosperity and demystifying prosperity, and that was the question of prosperity is, what emerges from this place, essentially what emerges from this place of enough, right? And so we're going to explore that idea more today. And so that's been the theme. So I've been really pondering that, contemplating that, writing about it. It's kind of coming through in a lot of the writings I'm doing this week, which is really beautiful. And there's kind of two things for this, right, that I want to bring up. One is that there is a tipping point I've found, and we're going to really look at that tipping point today. There's a tipping point into that place of enough, right? Where it's not just an idea that we have, like, oh, I have this idea that I am enough, right? But it's actually something like a somatic experience in our body where we don't just think we're enough, but we know that we're in that place of repletion, we're in that place of enough. And there is a tipping point into that I've been discovering. And it's a powerful acceptance. And it's kind of instead of that that go 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 attitude, that often grips us, do more, create more, make more, be more, accomplish more, give more. There's instead, after that tipping point, there's kind of this dwelling in, or an emanation from a place of peace or celebration. Right? There's enough in place. There's enough of a foundation in place that we can build upon that. So when good things happen, instead of seeing it as kind of just maybe one more brick to stack, right, and then move on to the next thing, we're actually able to really savor it and to celebrate, or to allow kind of the peace of our accomplishments to wash over us. And there's something. So there is a tipping point, and and like I said, I'm kind of framing this, and I like to start in some ways a little bit abstract, and then we're going to come back. We're going to always come back into something more concrete, actionable practices for you, contemplations for you. But there is kind of this idea that I've never really, it's never really sat well with me. This idea that, in order to know peace, we must know conflict, or in order to know prosperity, we must know lack, and I feel like, even though, and, in order to really appreciate it, right? In order to appreciate, I don't know, being a meal, we have to know hunger, right? There's this kind of this belief that good things can only come through this duality. But what I've been discovering is that once we go past this tipping point, I'm going to talk about, in this episode, I'm going to talk about kind of how we can begin to feel into that tipping point from scarcity, from acting from a place of scarcity to acting from a place of celebration, a place of peace, that place of enough that we feel, when we feel we are enough. Once we've kind of allowed that tipping point to take place in our lives, because it is an allowance, it's not something we can ever force. There is no longer duality. There might be kind of this is really hard to explain, and this is why I'm writing a book kind of that talks about this, but there might be like a memory of it, of perhaps that scarcity or that lack, but it's not really present anymore. And that feeling of peace and celebration, fulfillment, enough, that's what just kind of is. And you allow that to become kind of the daily experience of your life, within all the human this and that and experiences, and unexpected happenings, and the larger kind of bubble, you could say. It's like you're almost imbued in this place of, but I am enough. And so all this other stuff is kind of just happening within this larger consciousness of enough. And that is not, I've discovered, that is not a state of duality. I'm not constantly comparing a place of enough or a celebration or a peace to a time of scarcity and lack. It's just, it kind of becomes the experience, the overall experience. And so, and that's important, because that tipping point means that there's been an irreversible transformation, or true healing is occurring, right? If you've been in toxic situations and you emerge for good into a place of worthiness, and you begin to accept nourishing, supportive situations, people, relationships, that becomes your reality. And the thing that came before, it's almost sometimes like that happened to another person. And I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but as I said, we're going to go through all these different things of enough. And I just wanted to frame this because I do want to offer kind of a different perspective to this idea that you must suffer in order to know peace, right? Up until now in humanity, that's been a thing. But there is this point, this tipping point, where we come to, where that duality, that twinned, the idea that this is only existing because something else existed, right? I only know peace because at one point I knew suffering, right? Then those things become twinned, versus just the allowance of this peace or celebration or fulfillment to be just its own perfect state of oneness. So I did want to frame that. And if you're like, what is she talking about? Don't worry, just let it roll off. We're gonna keep moving. I'm gonna offer a lot of different ideas in here, but that felt important to name. And that is, again, once that other experience becomes kind of almost like tuned down, like the dial on it, previous suffering, previous patterning, previous conditioning, that dial kind of gets tuned down. It's kind of low in the background. It's not really the forefront of your experience anymore. And then suddenly it kind of, maybe someday it just disappears entirely, right? As it just leaves your field, whatever that suffering conditioning was for you. I believe that really is the essence of true healing. That's the threshold of true healing, where we've just allowed this conditioning, oftentimes through trauma or through suffering, or through whatever the conditioning is that you picked up as a child that stopped you from being able to access that true self, that true voice of yours, when that becomes less and less and less and less of an influence until it finally just dissolves, that's an irreversible threshold, and that's what I kind of refer to as true healing. So, as I'm speaking about this enough, this way of enough, right? What is it in your life for you? That framing that can become to be that can come to be kind of your full reality when we allow it in more and more, right? And it's a process, of course, as all things are, when we're living in linear time. So a lot of this is when it starts to happen when we begin to claim kind of our true design, our true purpose. So again, I believe that all humans have come here with a very specific design to contribute a very specific type of wisdom to humanity. And you're perfectly designed for this purpose. And when we begin to really tap into that purpose, live that purpose, articulate that purpose, live it, understand it, know it, become it, right? That's kind of that's when all those other things, the conditioning, the trauma, the suffering, all that becomes less and less riveting, right? And then eventually that's not the narrative of your life anymore, whatever that was before. And the narrative of your life becomes something new. It's this whole, fulfilled, self-realizing kind of being, way of being. And that becomes the new narrative of your life. Again, that's kind of how a lot of different ways to look at what I kind of call, what I refer to as healing, right? Healing is that irreversible threshold. And so the thing is, so let's come back to this idea of enough. So I had kind of a big frame. Hopefully you're still listening. You're like, what is this lady talking about? That is just way too far out there. I had this big frame. But let's come back to this idea of enough. So again, I said there were kind of 4 aspects of that idea of enough that we're going to explore today. And the first thing I want to bring up is that I've talked about this before in different contexts, but you're going to know when you've reached this point of what I call repletion, or this tipping point of enough. You're going to know. It's not something that is going to be available for questioning, because it's going to be a truth that has become kind of indelibly anchored, right? And you'll also know when something isn't enough. So there's oftentimes this I've talked about it before, but it's really relevant in this context. This idea of gratitude, right? Oftentimes gratitude, it can be something that's been kind of used as a shaming mechanism, like, oh, you should just be grateful for da 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 da. But gratitude is not something that you can force. It's a natural arising. In the same way that like joy is a natural arising, right? You can't force these things. And so if you're in a situation, it could be a relationship, it could be a job, it could be even a place, or a place that you're living, whatever it is, right? If you're in a situation that is not resonant with your deepest truth, there's no, what I'm maybe taking the pressure off for you to try to pretend like it's enough or that it's right. And there were many times, I think, when I was just so exhausted from the journey of trying to find what this was. But there was always this part of me that knew I couldn't rest in a place that wasn't right for me. A situation, a relationship, a job, whatever it was, a community, whatever it was. If it wasn't right, if it didn't resonate deeply, there's always this part of me that just kind of knew, okay, it's time to move on, or we know that we can't actually spend a lot of time here. And so there's this, what I'm also offering is that if there's a part of you that just knows that something isn't right, you don't have to pretend like it's enough. You don't have to try to force yourself to be grateful for something that isn't right for you, right? And so oftentimes what that means is that you move on from something or someone without knowing what the right thing really is, because you haven't felt it or you haven't gotten there yet. And that can be a tremendous act of courage. But at the same time, trying to rest somewhere, like I talk about, kind of as an analogy, I think in the last podcast about prosperity, I talked about you'll know when you're at the top of the mountain, and you can't lie to yourself if you're on a ledge and you need to take a rest. That's fine, but there's a part of you that knows that you're not there yet. So take a rest where you need to take a rest, but then there's a part of you that knows that I haven't reached that tipping point into enough yet. Right? There's still more to do, somewhere to go, something to try, something to accomplish, something to experience before I can get there. And that's just a natural kind of way of the soul. Like I love this line from Ram Dass, and I can't remember exactly which lecture it was in, but he said something like he was talking to a friend, and it may have been even like someone in the spirit realms, but he was talking to them, and he was like, what am I doing here on earth? I don't want to be here. This isn't, I'm much too pure for this, I think were his words. And his friend, who I think was maybe someone in the subtle realm, said to him, like, you're on earth, just take the curriculum, right? So when we haven't arrived yet, and I talk about that moment of arrival, you will know the right person, the right place, the right situation, right? Does it mean it's forever? We don't know, but you know that it's right at the time, right? There's that moment of arrival. And if you haven't experienced that yet, allow yourself to be taken by the curriculum. Know there's something more to experience. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means that your soul has elected to have a number of experiences, and there's something within you that says it's time now to move into that new experience, right? So there is that moment of arrival that I like to call it, when you have reached that point of enough within you, around you. And I don't think that's something we can force. I think that's something that we receive in a timing that is far beyond our own like personal will. So I talk about that oftentimes your path, it's going to take you, sometimes it has to take you, what I said it in my, I believe in my memoir, which I said you sometimes you follow this, whatever this is, this impulse, this knowing, this nudge, and you have to follow it all the way to your breaking. Like for me, that's been a number of things. Like I've needed to be broken a number of times because I couldn't rest until I knew what my limits were, right? And just as a quick example, physically, in 2018, I spent the entire year training for a race series in Colorado, and it was it was called the Triple Crown. And in March there was a ski mountaineering race, and then in September there was a back-to-back running race, and then the next day a mountain biking race, and it was all over Star Pass. So if you know Colorado, it's between Crested Butte and Aspen. I spent all year training for that, the entire year. That's all I did. Two sports that I'd only played for a year. So mountain biking, I'd only been mountain biking for a year. Skiing, I'd only been skiing for a year, and I signed up for this race, and there was, for some reason, just not one part of me that questioned my ability to do it. And that race, I finished the race series. But that kind of took me all the way to my breaking, and after that, there was this repletion in some ways. Like I felt like I had arrived. Like after that, I was done with racing. I was fine. I felt like I had, whatever that was, I needed to know what that was, those limitations. And I completed it, and I said, okay, that's enough. And I haven't raced since, and I've been fine with it. And so for some reason, for me, that was necessary, right? So you'll know what that is for you, because you'll reach that place. But let's go into these kind of 4 different things of enough. So there's a frame for you. Again, take what resonates, let go of what doesn't. But let's start with the idea of having enough, right? And again, you'll know when you don't have enough, and it's okay to say, I don't have enough. And sometimes what you mean by that is, I don't have the right thing. And again, there's a lot of power in claiming when something is enough and is not enough. Like there's when you don't lie to yourself, right? If you are really really hungry and someone gives you a small meal or an hors d'oeuvre, there's a lot of power in saying that wasn't enough. I need more, right? And that's okay. That's a huge sense of personal empowerment, right? So having enough, right? A big part of having enough is claiming that you're worthy of that kind of fulfillment. What's been really interesting for me in having enough is I've started to orient that around when I talk about my kind of my purpose, my true purpose. And the more I can articulate what that is, what my purpose is, and the more I can claim my design for that purpose, what it means is that for me is that when I have enough to fulfill that purpose, suddenly I feel like I have enough in life. Whereas, and so here's an interesting example of having enough. So if I'm talking specifically about, let's say I'm talking specifically about money, this really interesting experience this past year where I had been working at a job that wasn't right for me. And I ended up taking a leave of absence. And this is interesting because I'm going to bring in a personal story about this because I feel like it really illustrates this idea of the feeling of enough, right? And in this case, having enough, I'm really relating it to kind of a deep fulfillment of your purpose. And this job I had was not in alignment with my purpose. And it's hard to explain. On paper, it looked a lot like it could have been. But it just wasn't. And there's a deep part of me, again, could not pretend, could not really even be grateful for it, at least not then, because I just knew that it wasn't right for me. And so I ended up, and I felt this like pinch of scarcity the entire time I was in this job. And honestly, it didn't really almost matter how much money I was making. Because I always felt like I was somehow in that job, I was living kind of paycheck to paycheck. And something really miraculous happened where I was able to qualify for a leave of absence. And if you're in Colorado, you should look into that because it's really, really beautiful. It was like a miracle where I qualified for this leave of absence. And I was able to take a long leave of absence from the job that was paid for, but I got paid the same amount on the leave of absence that I got paid while in the job. And what was really miraculous about that was even though I had the same amount of money coming in, because I had this space and this time to focus on kind of this powerful purpose of creation, so it gave me a lot of time to focus on my third book that I'm writing, I felt replete. I felt like I had enough, even though it was the same amount of money, right? And so there's this kind of play here that's hard to explain because sometimes it's just not enough. Whatever you have, it's not enough. And sometimes what it really means is it's not right, right? It's never going to feel like enough if it's the wrong thing. And you can't nourish yourself with the wrong thing. More of the wrong thing is not going to fulfill you. Right? So there's a part of me that just knew if I was working this job and even if I took on other responsibilities and received more money for it, there's a part of me that knew that none of that mattered for me because I needed to be walking my soul path in order to feel like I had enough. And that is what happened. That is what happened. And when I began to really live my design, live my purpose, right? When I began to write this third book, suddenly I felt abundant. Same amount of money, totally different situation. Totally different situation. And suddenly I felt like I just had enough. And there was a big, big feeling, there's a huge shift that happened there for me. Right? So this idea of having enough for me as I'm experiencing it, when I was writing my second book, Finding Home, and I didn't know where I was going to live. I thought I needed, and I've mentioned this before, but I thought I needed like a really big house to be satisfied. What ended up happening was I bought a 400 square foot house, like literally a tiny house, and I adore that house. It's perfect. It's just the most perfect little place, and it was enough. And so when I and what was really significant was that I reached the energetics within me had come to rest at that point. For whatever reason, I had found the right place, the right people, and then suddenly the house appeared, and it was completely different from anything I would have imagined that would have fulfilled me. So when I came from a place of scarcity, what happened was it was like it was amplified. Like what I thought I needed was much, much bigger because I thought I needed something huge to fill this kind of lack that I felt within me. I thought I needed a really big house to be happy. And what ended up happening was I just needed a small house because I had already reached that tipping point in some ways. And so having enough, when I refer to that, there is, of course, like that level of just there where you just don't have enough, right? And then, but the way I've been experiencing it is having enough oftentimes for me refers to that feeling of fulfillment and like I'm really just walking the path that I came here to walk. And when I'm doing that, I have a feeling of traction and abundance. And that idea of fulfillment is the foundation from which other things can come in. And so having enough, just again, if we're going to look at this idea of having enough, more of the wrong thing will not fulfill you. But sometimes it's just the smallest amount of the right thing that does. And so when we're talking about having enough, oftentimes it's helpful to kind of switch your perspective. It was helpful for me to switch my perspective from I need more and more and more and more to I just need the right thing for me. And then that fulfillment will allow me to feel like I have enough and will lead into that feeling of abundance. So that's kind of what I've discovered about having enough. Okay, and then related to that is this idea of being enough. And this is a big theme of this week when I talked about the writing group and how we had these themes. This idea of being enough really is related to that. And this is related to having enough. So I've discovered for me that the idea of being enough has a lot to do with resting into my true self. So when we're talking about a kind of a projection of the self or that conditioning, right? I talk a lot about conditioning that we receive as children, like layers on top of who we really are. And we're born knowing who we are, right? But then we're layered on top of that. This is who you should be. This is what should fulfill you. You should look like this, do this, be like this. If you accomplish this, you'll be happy, all that stuff, right? You begin to peel back those layers and suddenly there's this moment where you kind of alight into your true center, who you really, really are. And that is related. These are twinned. So the having enough and the being enough, I believe, are like kind of twins. They're very intertwined. When you know who you are, when you know what your purpose is, or when you know who you are, you know what your purpose is. When you know what your purpose is, you know who you are. So they go together, right? So having enough and being enough are oftentimes, and if you're watching the video, I've got like my fingers crossed like this, like they're twin, they're intertwined. They're like these intertwined strands, and they inform each other. So when you begin to rest in your true center, who I truly am, that kind of helps you understand what you're here to do. And it also helps you understand that is simply enough, because your true self is perfectly designed to accomplish your true purpose. So the more you can rest into that and know that, the more you're going to feel like you simply are enough. Right? And all the trappings of the world. So if you look at some of the things, I remember my parents moved recently. I wasn't expecting to bring this up, but this is kind of interesting. My parents moved recently a few years ago. They retired and they moved from Minnesota. And there were all these boxes of old, like they lived there since I was a child, and there were all these boxes of old kind of just paraphernalia from our lives. And they had saved in this really thick folder all of the academic accolades I'd ever received as a kid. And this was a very thick folder. I loved school, and I was very, and I had accolades that I hadn't remembered I'd achieved, and there was just a sheaf of it. And then growing up, obviously, I pursued that until I received my doctorate, and I earned my doctorate in education. And there was this part of me that just always was hungry for learning, for experience, to be kind of immersed in new thoughts, new ideas. And in some ways, it's nice to have a diploma that says, I've accomplished this kind of high level of education, but that's kind of a trapping, right? What I call it, like a trapping, or it's one of those kind of this world trappings for a deeper truth about me, which was just that I adored learning always. And I was hungry for it. And along the way, these accolades and this, diploma and all these things, kind of just, but they weren't the thing, is what I'm trying to say, is I wasn't doing it to get the thing. Those things were just pointing at a deeper truth of who I was, right? Same thing with a lot of the, kind of the athletic medals that I received and things like that. It wasn't that those aren't who I am, but they point to a deeper truth, which is that I physically, mentally, academically, I just always need to stretch my limits, right? And so there's this part of me that was always seeking for that. And so once I began and I don't know why I brought that up, except to say that there's probably a lot of clues around you. If you're kind of like, well, who am I really? What is my purpose, right? There's probably a lot of clues around you that point to that when you're open to it, right? And these all just point to it, really. And you begin to follow those clues until becomes a deeper knowing of who you are and what you're here to do, right? And I mean, and what happens is, as you begin to sink into that true self, maybe you take in the clues. Like when I was little, I published a book, my first book, I think in first grade. And I wrote it and I illustrated it and I made a cover for it. And like, there's something about that. And Parker Palmer talks about this too, about your true purpose. There's a knowing that you already have as a child, right? So I think I was always meant to be a writer in some ways, right? But then all these other things come in. So anyway, as you begin to really acknowledge and claim your purpose and your design and your passions and your desires, right? You begin to really allow your true self to come forward. And then in that way, your true voice also emerges, right? And when you are living within your center, claiming who you are, right? And especially those things that other people tell you should change about you, right? But that are actually huge strengths. You begin to claim all that. Your true voice begins to emerge, and suddenly you just realize you are enough within that. Right? You're not trying to energize a projection. You're not trying to energize conditioning. You're not trying to energize a version of yourself that isn't you. And sometimes this can get very subtle. For instance, I have a degree in education, and for a long time I was working in that field of education. And when I left that field, it was kind of surprising to people because it looked like I had been working toward that for 15 years. And it was very subtle because there is definitely a part of me that is very drawn to this idea of teaching, but in that specific industry, it wasn't right. And so it can get very, very subtle, right? When you look at these clues, allow them to speak to you, but allow them to speak to you at that deeper level of sentience, of that deeper level of knowing of who you truly are, right? And allow that to evolve. So your true voice, your true center is going to let that come forward. And that's that feeling of just being enough. I am enough. That tipping point. I am enough and I have enough for this purpose and for this truth of who I am. Right? That becomes not something you're trying to accomplish, but just something that you receive as a knowing. Right? It becomes just your way of being. So having enough, being enough, both related to deep fulfillment, true purpose, your true voice, right? And so you stop trying to energize dreams, ideas, ideals, versions of yourself that are not truly you, and suddenly that frees up a massive amount of energy for you to create what you did come here to do, become, create, right? So a lot of this, it has to do with delayering. And the more you delayer, the more you discover kind of the rich resource of your own inner self. So having enough, being enough, giving enough. I want to talk for a moment about giving enough, right? Oftentimes, especially those of us who are empathetic, who are highly accomplished, who love the people around us, right? We can often feel like we're not giving enough of who we are, right? To those people, or that job, or that situation, or that relationship, or whatever it is, right? And again, this idea of giving enough is, you are probably noticing a theme here. This idea of giving enough is also related to true self, true purpose, right? When you're aligned with that, the giving just feels like enough. And I'm going to talk for a moment about in a moment, I'm going to talk about reciprocity. But in this kind of this sense, and maybe as I'm talking, you can begin to feel it almost as a frequency within yourself, within your body. But this sense of giving enough, right? There's nothing about that is, you're not trying to prove anything. Again, trying to prove something is energizing a self that is not true, right? You're not trying to prove anything. You're not overstretching yourself. When you're resting in that place of true self, true voice, true purpose, then what you're giving has kind of a richness to it. And it has its own wholeness to it, whatever it is that you're giving, whether sometimes it's the gift of your attention, right? You begin to feel that deep sense of self-worth because you have tapped into that divine purpose, that divine sense of being. And so whatever you give from that place is inherently enough. And what oftentimes happens is giving from that place will generate a reciprocity. And reciprocity is something, I feel like I could do a whole podcast episode on reciprocity, and I probably will. Don't let me forget. But reciprocity is something I worked on a lot with there's a really wonderful woman I worked with to help kind of clarify a lot of these things. And so I worked with her on clarifying what I meant by reciprocity. And what I meant by that was there was a really palpable energetic exchange. So when I talk about being with people who deplete you, and I talk about this a lot, and that's going to feed into the last enough, right? When I talk about being with people who deplete you, or situations that deplete you, right? The way of the divine and the way of your purpose is going to feel like an amplification. When you give, it's amplified back to you, around you. The relationships you're in, the people you're with, when you give from that place, there's going to be a natural reciprocity where your light is amplified back to you and you're not depleted. And that's going to become kind of the way of being. And so if there's people in your life or situations in your life that are demanding more of you, that you prove, that you overstretch, right? Or that are claiming that you're not giving enough, right? Oftentimes these are not the places to focus your energy, because there's a lot of subtlety to this that maybe I'll go into another podcast, because sometimes we're holding back from giving out of some sort of fear, right? And all these things. But ultimately, when we've tapped into this deep purpose, deep center, true voice, and we're giving from there, right? that giving is something joyful, and it is, like I said, inherently whole, inherently enough. And sometimes we just rest in that and we say, this is what I have to give. This is all I can give right now. Sometimes we are exhausted, right? And it's okay to claim that, I just can't give that today. This is all I have to give. It's enough. The sometimes where I've come to is the light of your presence and the light of your attention and the light of your listening is so precious. And this giving becomes a very natural thing, right? If it doesn't feel natural, it's probably, again, a projection, an energizing of that projection. If you feel like I should be giving more, doing more, creating more, saying more, right? Take a moment, step back, and just listen to that deeper kind of voice within you. What is it that voice is saying? Oftentimes it's saying, if you're just listening, that's enough. That's a precious gift. If you're just present, that's enough. That's a precious gift, right? And this idea of wanting to overgive or overextend or overstretch, that comes from often a place of love. We just want to share, right? But it's not sustainable unless you're giving from that kind of deep well of your being. And what's going to surprise you is that the simplicity of your giving, you begin to feel like that is enough. And so we've got this having enough, being enough, giving enough, right? All related to the true self, true voice, true path, right? If you're not tuning into your true, deepest wisdom, walking that path, anything you give won't feel like enough because it's not coming from that sustainable place. I'm just going to bring this up because I did my doctoral research on burnout, which if you've listened to this podcast, you already know. I've mentioned that a lot, but it is related to a lot of things I talk about. And there's this beautiful image that Parker Palmer brings up. I think it's in his book, Let Your Life Speak, which I really recommend. It's this beautiful image of a tree, like a tree that bears fruit. And I must have brought this up before, but when we're talking about giving enough, right, the tree bears the fruit and offers it. And that's its gift. And the giving of it, the creation of it, the giving of it, it doesn't hurt the tree. It's a natural emanation. The fruit itself is representative of the energy and the signature of energy of the tree, right? An apple tree can't create an orange, right? So you've got the apple tree creating apples. That's its natural gift. That's its natural gift. And it gives, it fruits and it gives, and it doesn't deplete the tree to do that. And that's how the giving should feel, right? For you. It's just a natural gift. It doesn't deplete you. You give it. And there's oftentimes in the giving an amplification of your light, of your energy, of your wisdom in that. And then that becomes kind of an infinite echo chamber of giving and receiving. And that's going to be a hallmark of the right. That's going to be kind of one of those signatures of when you know you're in the right place, giving the right thing to the right people. You're going to feel amplified. Even if you're tired at the end of the day, right? There's a part of you that's lit up, excited, joyful, replete, right? That feeling of repletion. So having enough related to that fulfillment of purpose, that path, being enough related to that true center, that deep wisdom, that the true voice that emerges, and then giving enough, whatever is natural and what emanates from that path and from that wisdom that does not deplete you, but that in the giving is amplified. Right? And there's a natural reciprocity. All of that. These are the tipping points I'm talking about. Right? And allowing your life to speak to you about what these things are, by what feels good and what doesn't, right? A lot of times it's just that simple. This feels good. This doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel good. There's something else out there for me, right? So that brings me to my very last kind of facet of enough. which is one of my favorites. And it's the saying when you say enough, right? And this is I talk about I think I talked about in my first book, The New Eden Paradise Retold, and I talked about how I created a new mantra for myself, and it was just no thank you. And I discovered that just because someone or something wants to give something to me doesn't mean that it's the right thing, and I'm allowed to say no. And if I'm in a situation that isn't right, I can say enough. I will not take this anymore. I will not take it on. I will not take responsibility for it. This is, and it's this, that it's a, there's a lot of power in saying enough. I've had enough. This is enough. I'm done. And for me, the way someone put it, I think it was really powerful for me to hear, but like vast fields of karma were cleared when I began to say the word enough. I've had enough. We're done. And it was like that simple word no, right? So that kind of enough within that is the word no, right? Actually, literally the word no is within the word enough, which is kind of cool. But it was such a simple act to draw those boundaries, and it cleared absolutely immense fields of karma from my being. So when I talk about karma, a lot of times I'm talking about like that conditioning, right? So conditioned to I have this incredible I think she says about her own writing, but there's this scene in my memoir where I meet my true self, and what happens is in the meeting of my true self, and it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. I wrote something like, and I don't have the book with me, but I remember I wrote something like the self I had woven to meet this world, my true self, like together we fed that version that I talk about the version of ourselves that we're energizing, the conditioned version. We fed that kind of that woven version of myself. We fed that into the flames. So I was in a beautiful, it was a powerful vision where I met my true self. And there's this thing that came through, and I wrote about, and this version of myself had this kind of like cringing aspect, like this and I wrote it's like had this please don't hurt me smile, right? Like if I just and that's not who I truly am, but that's how I'd been living in many ways. If you read the book, you'll see that it was like goes into like a 25-year cycle of abuse, all these things, right? So that claiming of I've had enough, no, right? There's a lot of fear that can be associated with that, because when we set those boundaries, a lot of people were changing the rules on people. They don't like it. They start to escalate, right? But when we say enough, right? What we're really doing is standing in our worth and opening the space for what is truly enough, truly right to come in. Right? We say that is not right for me. That is not who I am. I will not give it any more of my energy. Enough. No. Done. And that will clear so much space in your life for the true path to emerge, your true voice to emerge. Oftentimes that enough, that's the first experience you have of your true voice and the power of it. So I think if I'm going to boil all of this down, or like distill all of this into kind of one piece of wisdom, right? Because we've been through a lot, and it's, as I'm glancing at the clock, like this has been, if you're still with me, nice. Thank you for joining me for this whole thing. If you're still with me after 50 minutes, right? I'm going to take this down to just kind of one piece of wisdom to hold. And that is that the wrong thing can't nourish you. More of the wrong thing cannot nourish you, cannot fulfill you. More of the wrong thing will never lead to enough. Right? So this journey that we're on is to find that right thing. And when we say enough, no, what we're doing is we're cutting off that stream, that energy stream, into a thing, a person, a relationship, a situation, whatever it is, a plan, whatever it is, we're cutting off that stream of energy. to something that isn't ever, we realize it's just never going to fulfill us, and more of it will never be fulfilling. More of it will never be enough, right? There was this, I just all these things. I have a very short page of notes today, so I'm kind of like just drawing all this. But there is this, I remember the moment, the time that I had, the one time in my life I think that I felt truly nourished. Well, it wasn't just the one time, but the first time I could say. And it happened while I was, the first time I went to Italy, and I was traveling in Italy, and I sat down and had a meal, and I felt like every cell in my body had been nourished. It was the best meal I'd ever had. There was nothing in that meal that created more hunger. Everything in that meal, it was, and if you've ever been to Italy, just, oh, the food. But it was such high quality, and it was designed to be nourishing. And growing up in America, I think a lot of our food isn't designed that way. It's actually designed to create more hunger, right? When you eat sugar, you crave more. When you eat this, you crave more. But this, for the first time in my life, I ate a meal where I felt replete at the end. And for the first time in my life, I thought, I don't want more. This was enough, this meal. I'm completely nourished. I'm completely replete. And that's kind of this feeling we're going for. You will know when something is nourishing you. You will know when something is enough, right? There's that tipping point. And then that becomes more and more the just the state of being that you begin to live in, because you can start to easily say no, enough, to the things that aren't right, right? Which then opens space for the right thing to come in. Like that no, that enough, that's a powerful tool for deconditioning. So having enough, being enough, giving enough, and saying enough. These are the ways, the facets, the ways we can play with the idea of enough, of repletion, right? And it all relates to that true self, true path, true purpose, true design, true voice. And nothing else will fulfill you or nourish you. So, just some ideas to play with this week. This has been the 25th episode of When the Heart Leads. I am your host, Dr. Kate Newburgh, founder of Books of Eden Publishing. I'm available as I've been working with people as a writing coach, and I'm also available as a business or a professional coach if you're ever interested in that. If you're interested in finding this enough or working with me on that, I'm available. It's something I love to do. And to check out more information on my work, my books, what I do, you can look at booksofeden.com, which is my website. It's been an absolute pleasure to connect with you all across time and space. Thank you so much for tuning in. From my heart to yours,